This week, we're talking about vicious cycles and delicious cycles.
You are listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It, the podcast for ambitious, high-achieving women who are ready to stop feeling stressed about work and kiss burnout goodbye forever. Whether you're starting a business or staying in your day job, this show will give you the coaching and guidance you need to start loving your work today. Here's your host, career coach Corey Lynn.
Hey y'all, happy Wednesday. I'm pretty excited to talk to you today. The thing I want to talk about, I was talking in a client call with a client about the idea of vicious cycles. And I was saying that for a lot of people, what they call the opposite version is a virtuous cycle. And I don't like that because I think it puts a lot of weight on morality and that this kind of cycle is a good cycle. And if you're a good person, you do this cycle. And I think that just adds kind of weight to the thing in an unhelpful way. So much of the time, I think we see certain activities as doing it right or doing it better or being a better person or being healthier. And I think those ways of referring to things actually makes it harder to do them. It's kind of like the word should. When we say we should do something, then that presupposes that there's a right thing and a wrong thing and a good thing and a bad thing, and we should do the good thing. And that seems like it would make us more likely to do the thing we're thinking of as good. But I find in practice, it often actually makes it less likely that we'll do the thing and more likely that we'll beat ourselves up when we don't do the thing. So I was I want to call it something else, the idea of the virtuous cycle. And I was thinking I think I've heard it called a victorious cycle before. So I was victorious cycle. But my client was delicious cycle. And I was oh, delicious cycle. I like that. And the client was yeah, because you use the word delicious all the time. And it's funny because another client recently also was I want a Corey word for this. What's a Corey word? Oh, delicious. And between these two things, it came to my attention that I guess apparently I use the word delicious a lot. And the funny thing is, y'all probably know this already because I probably, if I'm using this word a lot in coaching calls, I'm probably using it a lot on the podcast too. And just, I wasn't really aware of it. So I think that's super fun that we can know ourselves so well. And I'm a pretty reflective person and I think about my language a lot. And still, this was kind of a fun surprise for me. I also think it's fun because the word delicious to me is so much more, fun than the word virtuous or even victorious. Virtuous and victorious sound like things I should, again, there's that word should be striving for. And also maybe they're going to be hard. I don't know. I'm just ugh. It doesn't inspire a lot of delight in me. A lot of gooey, fun, juicy, yummy feelings. Whereas delicious does. Delicious is a really fantastic glass of wine or a really yummy French fry or, a really beautiful flower or a candle that just smells incredible. In short, I think the word delicious is a lot more fun and a lot more indicative of the kind of cycles I'm trying to build in my life and the kind of life I'm trying to have in general. I think my satisfying as fuck life involves a lot of deliciousness, and maybe yours does too. And if it does, steal this word and use this phrase in your own life. And if it doesn't, find a word that feels yummy to you. We don't all have to be the same, which is great news since we're not all the same. And we all have our own different preferences and word connotations can really vary a little bit and even dramatically between people. And one of the things with coaching and with thought work, which is the work of choosing our thoughts and mindsets on purpose that we talk about all the time here, you really have to figure out what feels good to you, because a thought that feels really yummy to me, a narrative that feels delicious to me, may feel unsettling or constricting to you. And so you got to figure out what works for you specifically. That's that. Let's also, though, talk about what's a vicious cycle, what's a delicious cycle, and how can you use these concepts to create more of what you want at work and everywhere else in your life. Okay, so I'm going to use a basic example with self-talk. Okay, so like let's talk about the vicious cycle first. Let's say like you're working on a project and it's a little challenging and you're saying things to yourself like, you should know this already. I can't believe this is hard for you. You should be embarrassed. If everyone else knew that you were struggling with this, like they would really question you being in your position and like making the amount of pay you make, right? These are kind of the kind of things that people's brains say to them all the time for most of us. But they're very unhelpful thoughts and they're kind of vicious cycle thoughts because when we have thoughts like that, when we doubt ourselves and like it's harder to focus, it's harder to do the work, we usually don't do as good of a job, right? And so then we get like whatever the outcome is on the work. And then that reinforces the thoughts that we were having and makes it easier for us to believe them, which makes it harder for us to do the work next time. More likely we'll procrastinate, more likely we'll doubt ourselves, more likely we'll question like, what are we even doing in this role? And we'll feel like more and more of an imposter. And it's going to keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. And the idea with the viciousness is that like it's self-reinforcing. It's actually the idea with the cycle part. Like the viciousness is like what's happening. And then the cycle is the idea that it's self-reinforcing. So the more we're in that cycle, the easier it is to stay in that cycle and the easier it is to believe all of those negative thoughts. And when people come to coaching, a lot of people are stuck in one or often many different vicious cycles. It doesn't mean nothing in their life is working. As humans, we're like very complex beings and our brains have like a bajillion thoughts a day. So you may have like 6 vicious cycles going and 6 delicious cycles going and maybe like another 10 like sort of mediocre cycles going that are like not great and yummy, but they're like not so vicious and they're just kind of like maybe keeping you in sort of a status quo thing, right? But vicious cycles feel terrible and they're not very fun. And they can also keep us from building our satisfying as fuck life and our satisfying as fuck career, either because like they're keeping our performance like subpar because the cycle is like draining us so much that we're not able to do our best work. Or they also often keep people from like trying new things and taking risks because like that negative self-talk or like the negative habits that can also go with a vicious cycle just like keep us either stuck in the same place or they're like pushing us into worse and worse situations that may seem like they're just happening to us, but are actually part of the cycle. Okay, so like what would a delicious cycle look like, right? So if you're working on that same work project, it's a little challenging. A delicious cycle is like, what would be delicious to say to yourself? What would be a delicious outcome there? How do we get that for ourselves? For me, a lot of things, like if I'm working on something challenging, it might start with like, I can do this. I've done other challenging things before. I've figured out so many things. Like one thing I think I've talked about on the podcast before is that I do country dancing, which is like 2-step and line dancing. And when I first started, I was really, really bad. Like really, really bad. And I just kept going because I liked it and thought it was really fun. But guess what? Over time, I also got a lot better. And that is something that I can use now when I'm like trying to delicious cycle something is I can say like, okay, this feels really hard. You feel like you have no idea what you're doing. That's okay because we know we have this other data point that like you can get really good at things that you're not good at right away. And that's okay. And we can have fun doing it. I have that data set so I can bring that data set over and turn that into a delicious cycle. So like, let's say I'm working on the work thing and I bring in this like delicious feeling idea that I can figure it out. And maybe in 5 years, it's going to be as easy as country dancing is for me now. And if you don't have an example like that from your own life, you can borrow mine. You can be like, if Corey Lynn can learn to country dance, I can fucking do anything. Because that's like the level. If you had seen me when I was first dancing, I couldn't hear the beat. Y'all, I couldn't hear the beat for at least 4 years of dancing. And when I started hearing the beat, I was like, what the fuck? This is much easier when you can hear the beat. Anyways, so you can borrow that from my life. That's something we can do, like when we're delicious cycling something or coming up with like a mindset or a narrative or a thought that's going to help us in a situation and feel more useful. It doesn't even have to be proof or evidence from our own life. It can be proof or evidence from the world, from someone else, if it creates a delicious feeling for you. And in the beginning, it might not be delicious. It might just be like not quite vicious, or it might be medium, or it might be like moving towards delicious, right? Let's not be perfectionists about it being delicious. We're just like moving in that direction. So how does this go from being like, I'm saying something kind to myself to it being a delicious cycle? Well, like I'm working on the project. It's kind of challenging. I'm telling myself I can do it. I'm telling myself like, hey, if you figured out country dancing, you can figure this out. And then like, I'm probably going to get better performance out of myself because I'm having these positive thoughts and I'm orienting towards my capacity and my capability versus orienting towards my self-criticism. So I'm probably going to do a better job, which is already great. But then also when I'm in that headspace, I'm going to say nicer shit to myself about the performance I did. So like, let's say in the vicious cycle, I get like, these are not graded, but I'm just going to use grades to kind of like give your brain something to like think about that's specific. Let's say when I had the negative thoughts in the vicious cycle, like maybe my performance was like a 75 out of 100. But then if I have a bunch of negative thoughts about it, then I'm going to feel like shit about it. And then my performance is probably going to keep getting worse because I'm going to be like spiraling in that self-negativity. Whereas let's say in the good version, not good, but in the delicious version, like let's say with my positive self-talk, like maybe that improves things a little bit. It's going to improve the way the experience feels. And I still may like get like an 80% out of 100. So like that's only 5% more. I think that's still a significant margin, but it's like only 5% more. It's like not like I'm going to get 100, but the way I can talk to myself, like, yeah, really good job. You got 80%. This is just like the country dancing. You weren't perfect at first. You did dance for a lot of years before you got really good at it, but you eventually did get really good at it. So this is great. Keep going, right? And the more I do that, and the more that's how I'm narrating to myself, then the 80 is something to be proud of and something that's taking me closer to my goal. And that's going to put me in the delicious cycle. It's going to help me keep doing better and keep doing better and keep doing better. It's going to make it easier to keep being kind to myself. It's going to make it easier to keep performing well versus getting the 75 and then berating myself about that and then feeling like shit. And then probably my performance goes down. Or if it goes up, it's not a triumph. It's not delicious. It's like, but I should have been better the whole time. Right? So this is such an interesting point that like in the vicious cycle, you could actually have performance that's better than someone in a delicious cycle, but you'll have a worse experience of it because of that like narration and because of the meaning making and because of the criticism and the judgment and the blame about how you should be better already. And I think like, let's also take a moment to just talk about like a lot of people when they come to coaching are really mean to themselves. And that's like what they think they're using to like fuel everything in their lives. And they really sometimes are like reluctant to like let go of that like self-loathing, self-judging, self-criticizing, like beating themselves up. Basically, they think that's the key to their success. Y'all, it's not, because even when you do well, you feel like shit about it. And over time, you're going to stop trying because it's no fun to try and even like do pretty well and then feel like shit all the time. So like a lot of people like that beating themselves up thing, that maybe works for 5, 10, 15, maybe 20 years. Because a lot of us start it in like elementary, middle school, and we get to like our 30s and then we're like, I hate everything. Nothing feels good. I'm a failure, right? Then we come to coaching and the coach is like, what if we don't do that? And it's scary to let that go. And I get that. But I just want to offer to you that in the delicious cycle, it feels a lot better. It's much more sustainable. And also like everything we do, everything we try, even if it's not perfect, can be part of our greatness, can be part of our triumph, can be part of us building the life and career we want to have. And it's just like a much more fun way to do things. Also, it makes it easier to like stay on that track, right? Whatever we practice, we get better at. If we practice the vicious cycle, we're going to get better at the vicious cycle, but that's not like fun, good, better. That's like now we're just more efficient at saying mean shit to ourselves. And, you know, I think there's a lot of like going against the grind there of like, to like, and like willpower because we know it's all going to feel terrible. Whereas when we practice the delicious cycle, like it might feel alien at first. It might feel weird at first. If you've never done it, you might be like, this is strange. It's a new habit. But once you get going with the delicious cycle, this is renewable energy, y'all. Like it feels good to try things. It feels good to make effort. It feels good to like do new things. It feels good to do the work you're already doing because the way you're doing it, that cycle you have around it is delicious. A question I always get is like, but if I'm nice to myself, like won't I just like stop trying to do things? And I think this is such a funny question. Like why would you do that? Like, why wouldn't you be kind to yourself and then still go out and create the life you want? Like, why do we think we have to be mean to ourselves or we're not going to create the life we want? It's just like the premise that that's on is that you have to be miserable to change things. And one, I don't think that's true. And two, I don't think it's very fun. And it puts us in this place also where we're like, oh, I have to hurry up and get away from this thing because it's terrible versus like, my life's fucking wonderful. It's great. And there are things I want to change. And I'm going to change a lot of them, but I'm not in a super hurry about it. And I don't need the process of it to feel terrible in order for me to stay motivated. And I don't think you do either. Now, I've talked about this before. You may find that when you're in the delicious cycle, there are certain things you don't give a shit about doing. But like, maybe that's okay. Maybe we don't have to give a shit about doing everything. There may be some stuff that's like, you're like, oh, I was socialized to think that's important, but it actually doesn't matter to me. But I don't think it means you're going to do nothing. And maybe you would do nothing for a little bit because I think a lot of us were like overworked. And so we may need to rest a little bit, but like that's not going to be forever because humans like to do things. We like to learn. We like to work. We like to create stuff. And when you really believe it's possible to have that satisfying as fuck life and career, why wouldn't you work on it joyfully, deliciously? Like, why wouldn't you? It just doesn't make any sense to me. But it makes sense that we have that thought pattern because I think a lot of us learned that as kids and had it instilled in us. And it's a paradigm that we're very used to, we're very comfortable with. It's very habitual to us. It's like driving. Like we've been doing it for so long that it just seems natural, but that doesn't mean it is. And it doesn't mean you have to live your life that way. I just happen to think delicious cycles are a lot more fun. And also, as I was like talking about before, the vicious cycle stops working. People get burned out and they get into fuck it effect and they get into the pit of despair and like it just stops working. So why not try a delicious cycle instead? And the examples I've given in this podcast are about self-talk, but there's like lots of other stuff too. It's kind of like something I see is like if people drink too much and then they judge and shame themselves for drinking too much, then they want to get away from the judging and shaming. So what do? Their brain's like, have a glass of wine, right? So that's a vicious cycle too. And it still does involve thoughts, but it also involves like the action of like drinking of the wine. And nothing against wine. Y'all know I love wine, but I love wine as like a sensory delight that I include in my life, not as something I do to get away from my feelings, right? So in this example, someone's like drinking and then they drank more than they wanted to and they don't want to do that again, but then they have all that negative emotion and like maybe even feel yucky in their body, right? As a result of like the amount of alcohol that they had consumed, and they want to get away from those like thoughts and sensations. So they turn back to the very thing that they've judged themselves for. That's a vicious cycle because it's going to set you up to have the same thing happen again and again and again and again. Versus a delicious cycle or like a delicious interrupt to that vicious cycle could be like, hey, yeah, you did that. You drank 3 glasses of wine when you meant to drink 2, and we don't have to do it again and we don't have to beat ourselves up about it. And like, you know, even maybe something like, hey, we've been drinking since we were like, I don't know, 21 years old. And so, of course, changing this habit is taking time. And of course, we're going to like fuck up, and that's okay. We got this. You know how to fuck up and keep going and actually make changes in your life. And again, if you don't have an example of that from your own life, use my example, use anyone's example, use an example from like Oprah's life or Beyonce's life or somebody else's life. Like for me, it's like, oh my God, do y'all know how many times I fucked up at that country dancing before I got good at it? And I'm good at it now. And guess what? I still fuck it up all the time. I get my footwork wrong, all kinds of stuff like that. We don't have to be perfect to create a change in our lives. We don't have to be perfect to have a satisfying as fuck life and career and relationships. But I think one thing we do need to do, or one thing that's going to make it much easier to do that and is a very useful skill, is being able to tell when we're in a vicious cycle and then step out of it. And sometimes we may need to step into like that, you know, sort of neutral, mediocre cycle for a while. That's okay. Neutral is a great place to go if you've been in negative and vicious. And then I want you to think about what would be delicious. How can I step into a delicious cycle around this? What would that even look like? Blow your mind with the possibilities. And if you want some help figuring out what this could even mean for you and your life and your career, come hop on a consult call with me. Let's talk about it. Let's talk about how this would apply to your life and what a delicious cycle could look like for you. And then if you want to learn more about working with me, I will tell you about the ways I'm currently working with clients. All right, y'all, that's what I got for you. Have a great day. Just be delicious. Delight yourself. And I'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to Love Your Job Before You Leave It. We'll have another episode for you next week. And in the meantime, if you're feeling super fired up, head on over to CoreyLynn.com for more guidance and resources.